Even before the pandemic, there was significant economic inequality and high levels of poverty for women and their families. And so I'll give you a couple of fast stats here. So right now, and everybody's heard this statistic, that women make about 80 cents for every dollar that men make. And I will say on that, that's only gone up in the last few years. But as of this last year, we've now been set back to about 76 cents for every dollar that men make. And economists are saying it's going to be years before that gets back up to that 80-cent level. However, with that, Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous women make about 55 to 60 cents for every dollar. So when you do the hard math on that, those percentages, people like to toss them out. I certainly talk about them. But when you're talking about real money, we're talking about $30,000 a year. We're talking about $12,000 a year. That makes a huge difference in someone's life. So we see the concentration of women in poverty, particularly if they're single parents. And so these issues have only been worsened by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, because if they're losing jobs, and that economic inequality has only gotten greater for women and their children. So when we think about diversity and who that has had the most impact in the pandemic, Here's the hard truth. Women have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly Black and Hispanic women. So some of the latest data that we're seeing is that by the end of 2020, over 5 million women were unemployed. And women in the workforce right now is at a 33-year all-time low. Even this past week, Vice President Kamala Harris pointed out this was a national emergency, that women have pulled out of the workforce as a result of COVID-19, and it has significantly impacted the lives and families of Black and Hispanic women. The pandemic has had the most significant impact on women for three primary reasons. Number one, the job sectors in which they're in. For example, 77% of essential workers are women. The other factor is childcare, caring for children, caregiving overall. And then the third component I think about is the continued economic inequality and concentration of women in poverty. So the pandemic has really just worsened that situation. So as we all know, last March, when employers sent workers home, schools shut down, women took on the primary caregiving of their children, the education of their children. And so what we've seen in the last year is that many women have opted out of the workforce because it's too difficult to balance all of those things. And then additionally, for many of those women that are on the front line, so for example, healthcare workers, even in childcare, what agencies are still open, they've had to continue to go to work. And so that has also had a significant impact on their family experience, their kids' experience, their experience. And so it's sort of multiple factors that have kind of contributed to the greater impact on women during this pandemic. I think 2020 has, I think it's an understatement to say it's been a monumental year for so many people. Being in the diversity and inclusion space, we've had more organizations reach out to us and say, we know there are social justice movements. What can we be doing to be more inclusive as organizations? So we're certainly seeing a lot of that. And then I think from a community, from a city, from a societal level, the world is sort of seeing my experience is not the same. People do not have equal access. They're not in the same position. This is having a different impact. We're seeing that particularly with women, and we're seeing it especially with Black and Hispanic women and Indigenous women across the United States. So from a diversity and inclusion perspective, I think as a society, from a policy-making perspective, we have to address the inequality that women face among a variety of women and a variety of their backgrounds. And then additionally, as an organization, being mindful of families' different experiences, the differences that they're having to navigate in their own experience with kids at home, being mindful of that. That's one thing that I think a lot of workplaces are waking up to is inclusion is about race, it's about ethnicity, it's about your sexual orientation, it's about your gender identity, it's about ability, it's about all these things, but it's also about your family status, it's also about your experience at home, because if you're worried about that, you're not being your best self at work as well. So just keeping that in mind, I'm seeing a lot of organizations say, how do we further support families and how do we support women? How do we keep them here? How do we keep them in the workforce? When we think about the impact that schools shutting down, the impact of lack of childcare has had on the lives of women in the last year, it's been significant. Childcare access already was a huge issue, very expensive for families overall, and then add to it when some of those centers closed down, add to that when the schools closed down. And what we've seen is that many women took on the education of their children, the caregiving of their children. And so it was a choice of educating my child or going to work. And sociologists sometimes even call this second shift that women do, this caregiving, the household, the extra things that they do outside of work to keep the family going. They call that the second shift. And so what we've seen is that's been amplified this last year because traditionally schools and child care centers have been able to sort of pick up that piece, but now we're seeing more women doing that. So they've opted out of the workforce. And this has also had a very significant impact on particularly low-income communities where education was already a factor. And so for those families, we've seen even a greater impact because those women may have still had to go to work, so they weren't sitting with their child in front of the computer all day to kind of help them through that process. So the closing of child care centers and schools has had a tremendous impact on the decisions that women have had to make for their economic security and for their families. So I love that question about the impact of the pandemic on business owners as a whole, and particularly women business owners. So I'm a business owner myself, but I'm in the service-based industry. So I have a lot of flexibility in where and how I get my work done. But that's not the case for most women business owners. Many of them own what we like to say sort of foot traffic type establishments, so salons, retail, restaurants, and of course, as we all know, many of those have been severely impacted in the last year. So we're actually seeing a greater number of closures of those businesses for women-owned businesses. And historically speaking, as many of us know who are female entrepreneurs, it's harder for women to get funding for business. There's even a lot of data that sort of talks about how women, and particularly minority women, have been left out of even many of the PPP loans because of just access. So it's definitely having a greater impact on female-owned businesses, women-owned businesses than others. What inspires me to do this work is a couple of things. I'm just going to own the elephant on the sidewalk here. I am a white female who currently identifies as middle class. I have more resources to help be a voice for this. And many of the women that we just talked about, they're stretched thin. They're caregiving, they're working, they're on the front lines. So I do have the privilege to be able to be a voice for this, and I don't take that for granted. The other piece, quite frankly, is personal. I'll try not to get choked up here. But when my parents divorced, my mother worked 3 jobs. I worked a job, my brother worked a job. My mother worked 9 to 5, and then she came home and worked at a catfish restaurant at night. So the struggle that women have from an economic perspective is very personal to me. I've watched how it happened. My own mother, nothing changed, but her circumstances changed. And that, I think, is what we're seeing in the last year, is the circumstances surrounding women's lives have changed, and they've had to adapt, and sometimes at a cost to them, their work, their families.